Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have my May wrap up. So May felt like a little bit of a weird month. I did take a week off at the beginning of the month. I did still do some reading, but I wasn't reading like every day like I normally do. I took a few days away from pretty much everything and it felt really good. And when I was reading through May, I felt like this was just kind of like an average month for me, you know. I've also fallen into the weird habit of not really reading too much throughout the week. I'm still reading, but I'm only reading like 50 pages a day as opposed to like 100 plus. And then because I want to finish a book by the end of the week, or I have a live show or something, I spend the entirety of Saturday or Sunday just like binge reading 200 pages. And if you've been with my channel for a while, you will know that that particular type of reading, like reading massive chunks at once, is not something I'm particularly good at because I'm not very good at sitting still and focusing for that amount of time. I'm the kind of person who like reads a chapter, then takes a 2-minute break and then goes back kind of thing. But May has actually been my best reading month of the year and I'm not really sure how that happened. So I read 12 books in total and I DNF'd one, but for my statistics I read a total of 4,266 pages, which breaks down to an average of 142 pages per day. For the star ratings, we had 1 2-star, 2 3 stars, 6 4 stars and 3 5-star reads, which breaks down to an average of 3.91 stars per book. For the demographics, I read 4 young adult, 4 new adult and 4 adults. For the formats, we had 7 standardly formatted novels, 2 manga, 1 e-arc, 1 ebook and 1 audiobook. For the genres, we had 5 fantasy, 3 fantasy romance, 2 contemporary, 1 romance and 1 thriller. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 7 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2021. 4 of them I have hauled in 2021 and 1 of them was a review copy from the author. So kicking off with the DNF, the book that I DNF'd in the month of May was We All Looked Up by Tommy Wallach. This is one that was on my unhaul cart that I read for my unhaul project. It is a young adult contemporary with a sci-fi twist, and in this one we are following 4 teenagers that come from 4 different high school groups. So we have an overachiever, an outcast, a jock and like an artsy kind of person, and they all vaguely know each other. They have vague connections, like one of them is friends with another one's sister kind of deal, and it is about what they are doing when they receive the news that there is 2 months until an asteroid hits Earth and kind of wipes everything out. So I made it 128 pages into this. The reason why I put it down is just that I was bored. I wasn't enjoying the writing style in this. I like stories that are contemporaries with sci-fi twists. An example would be the Orange manga series, because I like that slice of life kind of speculative, what would people do if this thing happened kind of story. But I was just really bored reading this. As well as that, this book definitely has some issues. There are instances of harmful racial stereotyping in here. There is a lot of fat phobia. There was a trans character introduced and the way that they were introduced made me feel slightly uncomfortable, and also some slut shaming. I would have still finished this book in spite of that if I hadn't have been so bored and kind of just highlighted those points in my review, kind of like I'm doing now. But yeah, I just really wasn't interested in this, so I put it down and I will be unhauling it. The first book I actually completed in the month of May was Crown of Gilded Bones by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This is the 3rd installment in the Blood and Ash series, which is a new adult fantasy romance series where we are following a protagonist called Poppy. Poppy is the maiden and she has been kept in, not really captivity, but she's kept on a short leash essentially. She's not allowed to talk to people, she can't be looked upon, she can't be touched, and despite all of this she has a little bit of a rebellious streak. She sneaks out of the castle where she's kept in disguise, sometimes fights back against the monsters that plague this world, and sometimes she just like sneaks into bars to have a little bit of fun. And then our love interest in this one is a young man called Hawk who has been assigned with guarding Poppy until her ascension. The ascension is this magical kind of process that is shrouded in mystery. Nobody knows what it is aside from those who have been through it, and those who have been through it don't really talk about it. And Poppy is set to ascend soon, but she's starting to question whether this life is something that she wants for herself. So this, like, I say it's fantasy romance because it has, like, it's set in a high fantasy world and it has a high fantasy feel to it, but it is also like on the borders of paranormal romance as well. The creatures that are in this series are a little bit of like a spoiler to discuss because because you're in the mind of Poppy, who is an unreliable narrator just because she doesn't know very much about the world, and you are learning about the world as you go through the books, and it kind of expands with every book in the series. So this one was my least favorite in the series so far. I gave this one 3 stars and I was really disappointed. I found it to be incredibly repetitive, and the previous books in the series had all of the same issues really that I had with this one. However, the things that I really enjoyed about the series were much more enjoyable in the first 2. So I really like the romance in here, and I really like the sexual tension between the 2 love interests. However, I felt in this one the sexual tension was kind of lost. I wasn't even enjoying the sexy scenes very much, and I found the romance to be very cheesy. Now, my biggest peeve with this series is that I find the world building to be lazy. Now, I understand that the context is that we are learning things as Poppy does, which is fine and makes sense, but it just feels lazy. Like, the world building isn't done and then it's just kind of brought in as it becomes more relevant to drive the series onwards. I found it to be incredibly repetitive. One scene that I can give as an example that still sticks in my mind and really annoys me is that Poppy is traveling somewhere and she's really stressed about stuff. So she's thinking like, oh, I'm really stressed because I wanted to do this thing and I wanted it to be really nice, but this thing has happened and it's like really bad now. And then on the next page, somebody notices that she's not feeling great and they say, what's wrong, Poppy? To which she says like, oh, I wanted to do this thing and I wanted it to be really nice, but now it's gone really bad. And it just like pretty much repeats everything that we've just read in her inner monologue. I do also think that in terms of the way that this world building is coming in, it is extremely dialogue heavy and it very much suffers from a case of telling and not showing. In the first 3 chapters of this book, we have 2 villain monologues from 2 separate villains in chapters back to back with each other. Most of the world building, especially as it's getting more and more expansive and more fantastical throughout the series, is done in dialogue. There is even like there's a character in here who is a prominent character throughout the series, but the majority of the conversations that the main character has with this side character in this book is info dumping the history of the world. A whole chunk of this book, like the first 400 pages I want to say, is Poppy just having conversations with people who give her an info dump about like the fantasy aspects or the lore and history of the world. And the thing that made this one a little bit more disappointing is that the last like 50-60 pages of this were 5-star material and I absolutely loved them. It's just the other, like, this is a big book. This is 650 pages, and the 600 pages that came before those pages that were 5-star material were just a huge drag. The next book that I read was Windwitch by Susan Dennard. I'm a co-host for the Witchlands Long, which is hosted by Jade from JD Ray Reads. So if you have read this one and you want to know like full spoilery thoughts, there is a live show on this book on my channel. The Truthwitch series, I still don't really have an age category for it. The confusion in the demographic is one of the reasons why I don't adore this series as much as I feel like I possibly could. But this is a young adult, new adult fantasy series. But in the first book, we are mainly following a young girl called Safi, who is a truth witch. Now, truth witches are especially covetable because they can tell when people are lying or telling the truth. So Safi has kept her power hidden her entire life. However, one day she stumbles across a blood witch who has the power to scent people's blood and track them across many miles. And from that moment on, Safi and her best friend Iseult are on the run, and they stumble into this like whole political mess between many countries and the leaders of those countries that centers around a 20-year treaty which is going to be coming to a close sometime soon. So I enjoyed Windwitch more than Truthwitch. I did tab this one as well because my main problem with Truthwitch is that I was just very confused because the speed of the pacing does not match the level of detail and information within the plot and the politics of this series. So straight from the first page of the first book, this is a very fast-paced series. We are hopping between action scenes, we're hopping between perspectives, and as you're just being thrown into the world and you literally know nothing about it, it can be very confusing, which led to me having a lot of confusion going through the rest of the book because I felt like while I was trying to process everything that was going on, I missed a lot of crucial information at the beginning. So I decided to tab this one so that I could refer back to points and everything that was notable was tabbed, and I do definitely feel like my comprehension was a lot better because of that fact. I was especially excited to read Windwitch because it follows my favorite character in the series so far, which is Merrick. Each book in this series is named after like a type of witch, and in the main cast of characters we have a character that is from that type. And where Truthwitch predominantly followed Safi, this one predominantly followed Merrick. One thing I really liked about this one is that it brought to my attention that all of the narrators in this series are unreliable, and once I got to grips with that and the fact that like what I'm being told in each perspective is only the limits of what each character knows, the reading experience was a lot better for me because I wasn't finding like so much contradictory information and getting confused, because there are instances throughout this book where characters are directly contradicting each other because the level of knowledge that each character has is different. I also really liked the introduction of a few new characters in this one. One of them is one who has been kind of established as a villain in the first book, so I really loved getting their perspectives and finding out what was going on there, what had caused them to have this like villainous nature from the eyes of different characters, and I liked how that expanded the story a little bit and added a little bit more nuance to this. Now I gave this book 4 stars, and my criticism of this series like still kind of stands the same. This has a very fast pace that is typically seen in young adult fantasy. I mean, there is fast-paced adult fantasy as well, but it also has a very complex political system. The magic system isn't quite as complex, but the lack of detail in explaining exactly how the magic system works adds a lot of confusion for me, because I personally like a really hard concrete magic system. But the expanse and complexity of the politics in here I find is really jarring against this fast pacing, and I think that that creates a lot of confusion within this story, and it's really jarring to read when you have these fast paced action scenes paired with such complex detailed politics. I then read volume 7 and 8 of Children of the Whales by Abby Umida. I gave volume 7 4 stars and I gave volume 8 3 stars. So this is a, I guess, like noodle age range manga series that follows a young boy called Chakaro, who is the archivist on something called the Mud Whale. Now the Mud Whale is this big floating island that floats on the sea of sand, and the residents of the Mud Whale have never known another human outside of their community. This all changes when their island passes by another and they decide to scout it for supplies, which is something that they do routinely. And on that island they find a girl who throws open their world completely, because she is from the outside world and she has a lot of knowledge about that, as well as knowledge about why the residents of the Mud Whale are trapped there and isolated from the rest of the world. My favorite thing about this series is the art style. It is what drew me to it, and it just does truly have a beautiful art style, which is one of the reasons why I continue to read it, because it is just consistently stunning throughout. But I will say, narrative wise, this is a little bit up and down for me. I am finding a pattern where like I'll give a volume 4 stars and the following one 3 stars. That is very much dependent on how far the narrative is pushed. I'm currently feeling that there is quite a lull in this series because the characters are traveling to somewhere and it seems like a long time since they set out, and they don't seem to be making very much progress. That being said, the magic is constantly being expanded and we're getting knowledge about all of these things that the Mud Whale residents kind of take as normal that are maybe not as normal as everybody thinks. We have quite a lot of internal politics on the Mud Whale, as well as more expansive politics around the surrounding world as well, and we're also getting like some flashbacks of notable historical figures within the period of the Mud Whale, and also the kind of ancestors or like earlier generations of some of the characters that are in the main cast. So volume 7 I really enjoyed. It also had like the darker pages are a big flashback section, and I really enjoyed that backstory because it was surrounding my favorite character of the series. And then this one, while it did contain a few flashback scenes, I just felt like story wise it wasn't really doing much. It was better than some of the filler installments in this series that I've read, which just seem to kind of abandon the plot line altogether and are almost a short story within the series. But in comparison to volume 7, I just didn't enjoy it quite as much. One of my favorite books of the month was Get a Life Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert, which I buddy read with Simon from Savage Reads, and we are going to be continuing and buddy reading the rest of the series. But this is an adult romance. It takes place in England, which I was surprised about. I had no idea that Talia Hibbert was a British author, because the majority of the hype that I've heard for this series comes from US booktubers. So I was shocked when I went into this and found out it was British. But Chloe Brown is a young woman in her early 30s, and she has fibromyalgia or chronic pain. And because of this, she doesn't really like to make new friends. She doesn't put herself outside of her comfort zone, and she prides herself on living her life and being successful, but she's closed everyone out pretty much because of the way people have treated her because of her illness in the past. In the very first chapter of this book, Chloe has a near-death experience, and this makes her want to push herself outside of her comfort zone because she feels like she's just not really living her life. And to do this, she makes a list of things that she wants to accomplish so that she can get a life. And she enlists the help of the superintendent of her building, Red, who is this like big, burly, long-haired, tattooed biker. So it took me a little while to adjust to the writing style in here. It is a very kind of like simple writing style, and I hate saying that because I feel like simple makes it seem negative, but what I really mean is like it is the opposite of descriptive or flowery. It's just a very straight to the point writing style, and I do prefer my writing to be a little bit more descriptive. But once I got into this, I really loved it. I fell in love with the character of Chloe because her humor is like sarcastic and deadpan and blunt and to the point, and that is something that causes a lot of conflict in this romance with Red, who is a very open, friendly person. He has some things that have gone on in his past which have made him a little bit more guarded, but generally he's just a really nice guy, and Chloe comes off as really like standoffish and snobby to him. So I really loved the banter in between these two because Chloe would just be being blunt and Red would take offense at that and get kind of surly, and the arguments in here were on point. One of my favorite scenes in this book is quite early on, and it is the tree scene, which you'll know if you've read it, but I just found the banter in here to be impeccable. I also really love the romance. When I was going into this, I was expecting it to be quite spicy because like I've heard people review this book, but the smut in here is explicit. Took me by surprise, but I am totally here for it. And there's one scene in particular, like one smutty scene in particular, that was so good that I was practically sweating while I was reading it. So yeah, this completely blew me away. I'm going to be reading Take a Hint, Danny Brown in June, and I'm really excited. Kind of sad though because it doesn't follow Chloe, who I've really fallen in love with, but I have heard that the series pretty much gets better with every book, and I'm definitely excited to find out for myself. The next book I read was Dark Harmony by Laura Thalassa, which is the third book in the Bargainer series, which is one of my favorite fantasy romance series. So in this series we are following a young woman called Callie, who is a siren, and she has a string of black beads that wind all the way up her arm, and each bead represents a debt that she owes to the bargainer. The bargainer is this big bad fairy guy who specializes in bargains, but it is very unusual for you to have more than one debt outstanding with the bargainer, yet Callie has hundreds, and one thing about the bargainer is that he always comes to collect. However, Callie hasn't seen him for the last 7 years. She knows he's going to turn up at some point, but she has no idea when that is going to be. So the first book is set in 2 timelines. We have the past timeline, 7 years in the past, where Callie is accruing all these debts with the bargainer, and then we have the present day timeline where the bargainer has finally come to collect. So the first book really focuses on the romance between the two of them, and then in the second and third book we get an expansion of the fantastical elements in here, and it focuses on a secondary fantasy plot where lots of fairy soldiers have been going missing and the women have been returned in glass coffins with these really creepy babies. So I gave the finale to this series 4 stars. I did really enjoy it, and I think that Laura Thalassa does a really good job of balancing the romance and the plot throughout the later books in the series. So I normally find that in romance I much prefer the will they won't they and the sexual tension than I do the actual established romance, but Laura Thalassa did a really good job of having many romantic scenes throughout this final book without me feeling like any of them were super overly cheesy. As you all know, I am a sucker for Desmond Flynn as well. He's one of my favorite love interests that I've ever read. This book was just nice to read because it's a series that I really like. I'm glad that I finally got to the end of it. I don't really have too much to say about this. I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was a well done conclusion to a fantasy series, and I'm really happy that I've now finished this series, although I am also sad because it's over, and unless I reread the series there will be no more Desmond Flynn in my life. I then read an e-arc which is Straight Until Morning by KJ Sutton. You guys may be more familiar with KJ Sutton as being the author of Fortuna Swan, which is another one of my favorite fantasy romance series, and I am also now good friends with Kelsey, so she sent me Straight Until Morning, which was a surprise release that was released earlier in the month of May, and this is a Peter Pan retelling. We're following Wendy, whose family has fallen on hard times financially, and since this has started to happen, her parents have pretty much just given up. Her father is now entirely dependent on alcohol, and her mother has retreated to her bed and refuses to get up and even like function to a basic level where she's looking after herself. Because of this, Wendy is the one who is looking after her family and trying to make ends meet. So when an affluential lady offers Wendy a way out, Wendy jumps at this chance. However, the task that this lady would like Wendy to perform is to kill Peter Pan. So Wendy travels to Neverland to do just that. However, she also finds herself growing closer to Peter. So I gave this one 4 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't like Peter Pan. I've read the book, not a fan, don't really like it. The Disney movie is okay. It's not one of my favorites by far. However, I do really love the character of Peter Pan, and like in all of the other adaptations I've read or seen, the character of Peter was my favorite element of Straight Until Morning. I just love the nature of Peter, who is this boy who doesn't want to grow up because of his past, and he's essentially just hiding from the things that scare him, and it's manifesting in this constant state of not wanting to be an adult. And I just find the character of Peter Pan to be especially heartbreaking. Something else I really loved about Straight Until Morning is that it gave Wendy a whole ton of agency. She is somebody who's had to step up for her family, and aside from that, she's trapped by the societal pressure of like the early 1900s and what society expects of women, which is not something that she actually wants for herself. So watching her push outside of those boundaries was really rewarding for me. As this is a fantasy romance, it is a smutty one as well. Wendy also goes through a sexual awakening in here and discovers that that is something that she may want as well, which once again is something that society frowns upon. So the reason I gave it 4 stars essentially is because I just don't like Peter Pan as a story, but I did find this to be a very good smutty retelling. My only other kind of negative about it is the pacing. Like, I felt like some parts of it were quite slow and some of the action scenes were a little bit too fast paced, but aside from that, I did thoroughly enjoy this one. And if you are a fan of Peter Pan in its different forms, then you may even enjoy this one a little bit more than I did. The next book that I read was a novella, and that was The Willful Princess and the Piebald Prince by Robin Hobb, and this is an Elderlings novella. It is recommended that you read it before the Tawny Man series, and it is like a historical account or legend of something that happened in the past of this world. So this is split into 2 sections. We have the Willful Princess and the Piebald Prince, and it's being told from the perspective of this woman who is the mother of a bard, and the bard tasked her with making sure that the story of the Piebald Prince is known. However, for her to tell the story of the Piebald Prince, she first has to tell the story of the Willful Princess, which is her story. The purpose of this novella is to give some background to some of the magical elements of the realm of the Eldlings, and specifically how one type of magic, which is the wit, got into the Farseer bloodline, and also why it is regarded the way it is in the realm of the Eldlings, because the wit is very much frowned upon, while the other type of magic, the skill, is something that is sought out. Like if you have the skill, then you are extremely helpful, and it is likely you will be recruited by the royal family to further train your skill. So I am not a huge fan of novellas, but I really enjoyed this one. Normally in novellas I always feel like something is lacking, but this one in particular I felt had a very strong narrative. The characters were established enough that I actually felt for them in parts, because as with everything that Robin Hobb writes, this is a little bit sad, and there were also points of humor in here, like multiple points throughout this. I was just like, wow, the audacity of these characters, because it was a little bit bitchy and backstabby in this like archaic high fantasy kind of way. It is only very short as well. It is 90 pages if you have the edition without illustrations, which I did because I was reading the ebook. So it is a very short read, but I do think that it definitely packs a lot in there, and it is a just really enjoyable story. It's really hard for me to convey with it just being a novella and not being able to apply it to the context. But if you are reading The Realm of the Eldlings, I would definitely recommend that you read this one before you read the Tawny Man series. One, because it's just really good. Two, because it expands the world and answers a few questions you might have after reading the Farseer trilogy. And three, because the actual story of the Piebald Prince is referenced multiple times in the first book in the Tawny Man series, which is Fool's Errand. And speaking of Fool's Errand, that was the next book that I read in May. It was another 5-star read for me, the first book in the Tawny Man series. Not really sure how much I can actually tell you about this one, because this is the third series in the Realm of the Eldlings. The Realm of the Eldlings is a extended universe that is broken up into 5 different series. Series numbers 1, 3 and 5 all follow the same character at different points in their life, and then series 2 and 4 are kind of a continuation of each other set in a different part of the world. So this is the first book in series 3, which means it is one of the ones that is a continuation of the main character of the Eldling story, and because of that I just can't tell you anything about the plot of this series because it will spoil the first trilogy. But in the first trilogy we meet this young boy called Fitzchivalry Farseer, who is 6 years old, and he is taken to the keep where some of the royal family are by his maternal grandfather, who doesn't want anything to do with him anymore and wants him sent back to his father. So Fitzchivalry's father is actually the prince in waiting, and when the prince in waiting finds out that Fitz is on his way, he abdicates the throne. He's very ashamed of himself for having a bastard son, so he abdicates the throne and he moves to the country, and from that moment on nobody really knows what to do with Fitz, so he's mainly raised by the stable master Boric. That is until Fitz gets to a certain age where the king starts to take an interest in him, because Fitz is in a unique position where he could become the royal assassin, as he is part of the nobility but also part of the common people due to being a bastard. So all of the books in the Eldling series are incredibly sad. We have these 2 types of magic which I've just touched upon, the wit and the skill. The wit is the ability to communicate with animals, and the skill is the ability to communicate with other people, like mentally. So what can I tell you about Fool's Errand? We are picking up Fitz's story when he is in his mid-30s. So the Farseer trilogy ends when he's like around 18-20, and this picks up when he's 35. After the events of the first trilogy, he has been living his life the way that he wants to for the first time that he has ever known. However, something happens that means that he is drawn back into the politics of this world, which is something he really doesn't want, and he has to kind of like revisit his old life and get mixed up in all of this stuff that he wants nothing to do with anymore. So I really love this installment. It could be my favorite Fitz book so far. Robin Hobb's writing, I would say, is very thoughtful, and she is very good with characters. Like the Fitz trilogies especially are very character driven, because we are in Fitz's head for the entire time. Most of them have very slow starts and are kind of monotonous. Like the first couple of 100 pages of this are just really trying to hammer in the monotony while also catching you up on what's happened in the 15-year gap between the trilogies and re-establishing some of the side characters. I always kind of criticize the Fitz books on being so slow because it is is a slog to get through the beginning of most of them. However, there is definitely a purpose in that, because without these slow starts to every book, they would not be as emotionally impactful as they are when you get to the like actual happenings of the plot. This is one of the saddest books that I have ever read. I sobbed reading this book. I've not actually cried to this extent at a book where it's like more than 1 or 2 tears. Since I read Kingdom of Ash in 2018, I was just sobbing. I could not recover. The sobbing just would not stop. Robin Hobb is definitely one of my favorite authors now. I really love how she balances these character driven stories full of emotion and like strong friendships and complicated relationships with a very like, I want to say subtle plot line, because it's not this like epic, like Fitz is not your typical fantasy hero. He's not charging into battle at the forefront like waving a sword. He's very much like your reluctant hero, and his story is very sad, but just, I don't know, I'm not being very articulate right now. I know I'm not, but I would definitely recommend The Realm of the Eldlings. They are also queer, I want to say. I read these as being very queer, and I know that people have different interpretations of them, but for me it is just like really obviously queer. There is a genderqueer main character, definitely, like that is definitely a thing, but there are also other queer elements to this series that I don't know. I never know whether to say they're explicit or not, because to me it's glaringly obvious, but because these were published in the mid-90s all the way up to 2017, I don't know how obvious like the queer coding in here would be to readers at the time when queer literature was not as common as it is now. Next up, I read A List of Cages by Robin Rowe. This was for Do the Thingathon and the latest installment of my Unhaul project, and this one is a very hard-hitting young adult contemporary. This one is dual perspective, and we are following the characters of Julian and Adam. It takes place mainly in a high school setting where Adam, who is very popular, he's like the nice guy at the school. Everybody really likes him, and this year he is going to be helping out the school psychologist as one of his electives. So the psychologist asks him to seek out this boy called Julian, who she is having trouble talking to because he's dodging her whenever she tries. Adam is overjoyed when he realizes who Julian is, because Julian was his foster brother quite a few years ago. Now Julian is a young boy, he's 14, and he's been struggling with his classes, so he does skip a lot of them. He also has a difficult home life. He had like a normal happy childhood up until his parents died. He lived with Adam very briefly, and then his uncle came and claimed custody of him. So straight up trigger warnings in here for child abuse. It is extremely explicit, it is extremely graphic in the instances of child abuse, and it is definitely a harrowing read because of that. Also content warnings for parental loss in here. Julian spends a lot of time thinking, especially with the juxtaposition of the happy life that he had with his parents compared to the horrible life that he has now with his uncle. He spends a lot of time thinking about what it was like when his parents were alive and what life might be like now, and all of the things that he can no longer do because of the loss of his parents. Now I found this to be incredibly emotional. I thought that the representation of parental loss was spot on as somebody who has lost a parent, and there is also additional representation in here as well because Julian is dyslexic and Adam has ADHD. I can't speak on whether those were well done, but the parental loss element was definitely spot on. So overall, this was just a very emotional read. I nearly teared up at multiple points throughout this because it is really quite difficult, but I also really enjoyed how Adam helped Julian and just how Adam was such a nice person. There are very few good people in this book, especially the adults. Everybody in the schooling system is awful. 90% of the adult figures, I think there's only 2 adults in this book that are decent people. The rest of them are truly awful. So this was definitely sad and also anger inducing read because I was mad at every single adult in here with the exception of 2. So if this is something that you are interested in picking up, I would definitely recommend it, but just please do take those triggers seriously because the child abuse element is very present in here. I'm then moved on to another book that had truly awful characters, which was The Luckiest Girl Alive by Jessica Knoll. This one is an adult thriller. I listened to the audiobook on Audible. I'm quite fussy with audiobooks. I did like the narrator of this one, but I do tend to be less fussy with thriller audiobooks and I will quite happily listen to thrillers, but this is set in 2 timelines and the timelines alternate between chapters, and we are following a woman called Arnie Finelli who in the present is about to marry this guy who's like really big on Wall Street. She lives in New York, she works for a magazine, and she's trying to climb her way up till she works for the New York Times. And the past timeline is when she attended this prestigious private school called the Bradley School, where something happened that you don't know what it is. That's like the main mystery of the book, and it is the lead up to this event. So the first thing I'm going to say is that every single character in this book, bar possibly one, is truly awful. 2 of them are like not great but all right. One of them's a decent person, the rest are terrible. The main character is obnoxious, she's a snob, she looks down upon people. When I first started this book, the way that she was talking about her childhood and growing up, I thought that she was from a background of like extreme poverty, but no, it turns out that she's middle class, and she's so ashamed of the fact that she grew up middle class that she tries to hide it in every single way, and just she's so privileged and just so entitled that it is infuriating to read from her perspective. Now there are a lot of content warnings in here. I'm going to list all of the content warnings for this book at the bottom of my description box because I cannot give you all of them verbally, because there is a really big one that is a spoiler and the key to the like whole mystery of this. But some of the content warnings include like homophobia, racism, and homophobic and racist slurs. There's a lot of focus on food, toxic diet culture, anorexia specifically, but also other forms of disordered eating. And there is also rape, victim blaming. Just everyone in here is awful. They do awful things, they say awful things. So just every content warning that you can imagine, pretty much. This is my least favorite book of the month actually. I gave it 2 stars. It was fine to listen to. I was listening to this while I was diamond painting, so it was pleasant to listen to, it was enjoyable to listen to, but this character is just the worst. She's so frustrating to read from because she's just not a great person. And the main mystery, as I've already said in here, is what happened at this school. And I personally really enjoy thrillers that have really big plot twists. This is also written in first person perspective, and when I read a thriller in first person perspective, I kind of like to follow an unreliable narrator, so you find out like at the end of the book that the person you've been following the entire time is not who you thought they were. Or I like it when it's kind of building up to an event in real time and the event in itself is like really shocking. And this was neither of those things, and the whole mystery of what it is that actually happened, in my opinion, happens way too early in the book. It's not at the beginning by any means, but there is a substantial amount of the book left after you find out what the event was. And the thing that frustrated me the most about this event is that it actually has nothing to do really with the main character. The way this is set up, you expect her to have done something awful or been directly involved in this event, or the event happening because of her, but it turns out that she just happened to be there at the time of this event, which was a huge disappointment to me because I've been following this character that I don't like. And don't get me wrong, I'm fine with unlikable characters, especially in thrillers. I come to expect it. But to be in the mind of this protagonist that I cannot stand for so many pages, only to find out that this event that she's talking about is nothing to do with her, was really frustrating to me. And then for the book to continue on, I'm not really sure what the point of the end of this book was. I don't know why it ended the way that it did. And I kind of did, but the ending that this has kind of, I feel like, goes with the assumption that you want this ending for the character. I didn't care about the character because she's telling me the story that is only indirectly related to her and as a matter of circumstance, and I care about the event. I don't care about her, especially as she's been established as somebody that I really don't like. So yeah, this was not the thriller for me. Obviously, especially with thrillers, opinion is very subjective, and I'm also not an expert on thrillers. I don't read a lot of them. When I do, I don't read them to be critical. I read them for enjoyment purposes. So if you want to read this, definitely don't take my opinion and my review as law, but I just wasn't a fan of this one. And And the final book that I read in the month of May was one with characters that I really loved, and that was The Wicker King by Kay Ancrum. I flew through this. I accidentally read 200 pages of it in the garden while I was getting some sun for like a couple of hours, and then I finished it up really quickly the morning after. So this one is kind of a blend of genres. I would call it a young adult contemporary, but it follows these two boys called Jack and August who have been friends their entire lives, and they come from backgrounds of neglect to different extents and in different ways. But Jack's parents are always away for work, so he is on his own a lot of the time. He doesn't see his parents very often, even though his family are quite well off. Like, he's not neglected in that sense, he's just always alone. August, on the other hand, comes from a family where his father has abandoned them. He sends his like maintenance checks occasionally, but he's not actually physically present, and since his father left, August's mother has withdrew, so he's pretty much taking care of her. They also have very different like social statuses in school. Jack's really popular, he plays rugby, and August is a drug runner and an outcast. However, these two boys are best friends. They have been best friends their entire life. Because of the backgrounds that they have, they really lean on each other and support each other, and they will do anything for each other essentially. So when Jack starts to have hallucinations, they start off quite small, where like he will see birds or people where there aren't any, and it very quickly descends to where what Jack is seeing is more hallucination than reality. So August obviously wants to help him through this and try and figure out what's going on with him. So August starts to play along with Jack's hallucinations to see if they can like go through it together and both come out okay on the other side. So this book is mixed media. We have like Polaroids, notes and mixtapes and stuff in here, and the way the pages are laid out, we start off here where everything's kind of normal, and the pages get darker and darker as we are tracking the extent of Jack's hallucinations. So I gave this one 4 stars. My favorite thing about this was the characters and the bonds that they have. It's definitely a very emotional read, but I just loved the extent that they would go to each other. It's not like a healthy friendship by any means, because they're both working through this on their own, and their behavior and codependency very quickly is noticeably unhealthy. This book is also like kind of a thriller, because you're reading it to see like how bad this is going to get, like what's going to happen to them. And it's also partially fantasy, because Jack's hallucinations are actually this fantastical world that come from a game of make-believe that he used to play with August when they were kids. My least favorite thing about this was the writing. Once again, a simple writing style in that it's not especially descriptive, not especially flowery, and I just think with the bond between these two and the relationship they have, I would have appreciated a little more of a poetical writing style. But aside from this, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I flew through it really quickly. I loved the characters and just watching this spiral, which sounds like a really big thing. Like, yeah, I loved watching these characters pretty much descend into madness. But yeah, it was a beautiful and moving story. It's a little bit ambiguous in the way that I usually don't like, where like you're trying to figure out whether this fantasy world is real or whether it's like hallucinations. But definitely would recommend picking this one up. It makes my heart hurt thinking about it because of how much I truly love these characters, and I also think that the atmosphere was on point in this one. So there you have it. Those are the 12 books and 1 DNF that I read in the month of May. The month of June, I have quite a lot of books on my TBR. I'm also a co-captain for Team Epic and High for Whatever-a-thon, which is a 1-month read-along hosted by Maddie from Book Browsing Blog. So I'm hoping to read a whole ton of epic and high fantasy this month, meaning that my my wrap-up next month may be quite chunky. But in the comments, please let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Please also let me know what your favorite book that you read in the month of May was. And aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish candle website, the Instagram for that, and 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.